todos. Muy buenos días, bienvenidos una vez más a este cuarto día del taller sobre regulación de dispositivos médicos y la herramienta de referenciamiento y evaluación para dispositivos médicos, el GBT Plus por sus siglas en inglés. Sin más preámbulos, doy la bienvenida y paso la palabra a nuestras colegas de OMS. Nuevamente, gracias Agnes, Andrea y Anita. Palabra con ustedes.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Good day to everybody. Great to have you with us on our last session for this exciting webinar. Today, we will be having a presentation by Agnes Kijo on reliance practices in the context of medical device regulation and look at some examples specifically in the GBT for the market authorization and registration. So over to you, please, Agnes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Can you please confirm if you can hear me? I'm trying to change my slide into presentation mode.
We can
Yes,
hear
we
you
can
well.
hear you well.
Yeah.
Yes, slides are up.
Perfect. So good morning, everybody, colleagues and friends. I'm happy to be here today to present very briefly on the concept of reliance in the context of medical devices regulation. I believe this is not the first time you are hearing about reliance. This is just my belief. In the last 4 years after publication of the WHO Good Reliance guidance document, the concept of reliance has gained a lot of popularity among regulators globally, especially in the market authorization function. And when you talk about market authorization function, you're talking about the assessment that is conducted by the national regulatory authorities to confirm safety and performance of medical devices and IVDs that is intended to be placed in the market. It includes dossier assessment or dossier review, site audit, but also testing or laboratory performance evaluation. It has not grown interest only to the regulators, but we've seen also grown interest in the regional harmonization initiatives. I've attended several meetings, for example, of the IMDRF. I've attended meetings of the Global Harmonization Working Party. I've also attended some of the regional economic communities meetings where we hear, great acceptance of this concept of reliance. So I will just go to my next slide. So according to the WHO good practices, which I'm quoting in this particular slide, this is a document that was published in 2021. Sorry, it is the WHO good reliance practices. There is also good regulatory practices document that also supports some of the concepts that have been included in the WHO good reliance practice. But here I'm referring to the WHO good reliance practices that says reliance represents a smarter form of regulatory oversight based on constructive regional and international collaboration that will facilitate and promote convergence in the use of common international standards and guidelines, resulting in more predictable, faster approval to improve access to quality assured medical products for patients worldwide. So this is according to the WHO good reliance practices. However, it is equally important, I think, as I begin to make this presentation, clarifying misconception that policymakers, regulators, or the public in general might have about reliance. And some of the misconceptions include loss of sovereignty. Sometimes regulators feel like they are losing authority with regards to a decision on specific regulatory functions. But there is also misconception that, reliance is about surrendering control. rather than reliance is about efficiency. And also the final decision is always rests with the national regulatory authorities. But there is also another misconception that reliance is for weaker NRIs, you know. But we have seen in the recent days, even mature and highly resourced NRIs practice reliance. And I'm taking an example of some of the NRIs in the European Union region, use of notifying bodies, for example, use of the Medical Devices Single Audit Program by the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum members. And so myth busting, I think, in regulatory reliance is about reframing it from a shortcut or loss of control, or it's for weaker NRIs, or it's for incompetent NRI, to a collaborative, resource-efficient, sovereignty-preserving practice that is intended to strengthen regulatory systems. And so just maybe to also go back a little bit to what reliance is and why are we promoting reliance. So reliance really allows the national regulatory authorities to make the best use of resources, at the same time building expertise and capacity, also increasing the quality of their regulatory decision, reducing duplication of efforts, and ultimately improve timely access of the needed products. And so when we talk about reliance, really is improving the effectiveness and efficiency of regulation of medical product, in which these days we call it smart regulation. And so I thought it was important really to address the issue of myth, the issue of misconception surrounding this important concept of reliance. I also wanted to speak a little bit about the scope, and this is actually based on the Good Reliance Practices Guideline guidance document, which really address all medical products. So it is addressing and it is applicable for medicines, for vaccines, for blood and blood products, for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, and it is also addressing all regulatory functions as defined in the global benchmarking tool, which I believe at this point everybody has access and is aware of the 7 functions that are indicated in the GBT Plus medical devices, including registration and market authorization, which is also market authorization. The terms are used synonymously, and then post-market surveillance, and market control, licensing, regulatory inspection or audit, laboratory testing, and also clinical evaluation. So this is a high-level document. The Good Reliance Practices document is a high-level document, which is complemented in a second step by a repository that we have developed at the WHO to demonstrate some of the practical reliance models that exists today. So I have provided also a link here, which you'll be able to access this repository and look at the, some of the reliance examples that you can also maybe relate to your situation and consider also to adopt. But key message is that you can apply reliance concept in the life cycle of a medical device in this context, because we're talking about medical devices. And I've also mentioned the functions that are associated with the life cycle of a medical device. Again, I think I also talked about this in my first presentation on the first day on the issue of risk-based approach. And so we do expect that each national regulatory authority defines its own strategy based on risk assessment on how to implement reliance. And key message here is that not one size fits all. So you really have to make sure that the strategy that you're planning to adopt, or the strategy that you have in place, really addresses your own context, your own need. For example, some of the elements that can be considered when you're thinking about adopting any of the reliance models is the public health needs and priorities. These public health needs and priorities differ from one country to another. So very important that you look at what are your priorities, what are the needs, and if reliance could be one of the approach that can really support implementation of your needs and also, or addressing your needs and also priorities in your country through the Ministry of Health. But it is also very important to look at the level of resources. So different regulatory authorities have different capacity in terms of resources. And resources, it could be human resource, it could be financial resource. So expectation is the national regulatory authorities would really critically assess itself to say, what is the level of resource I have? Can I be in a position, for example, to benefit from another national regulatory authority for a specific regulatory function so that I can really focus the limited resources I have for a specific regulatory function? And also expertise. And we have seen, I think, based on my multiple interactions with regulatory authorities, especially in the area of medical devices and IVDs, there is always concern about expertise, whether there is adequacy in expertise within the national regulatory authorities, especially for most of the regulatory authorities where they are coming from the pharmaceutical background. So they used to have, or they have already very strong foundation in pharmaceutical regulation, and they are now introducing regulation of medical devices and IVDs. So this is an opportunity for national regulatory authorities to really examine themselves, to check themselves, assess themselves, to say, okay, is there a specific expertise that we are lacking that can really jeopardize final decision in terms of safety and performance of our products for medical devices, for example? And would you benefit if, for example, you request support or you request assessment outcome from another trusted institution, for example, through the WHO pre-qualification assessment outcome? So these are some of the things that needs to be considered when you're strategizing on which reliance model to adopt. And then the type and source of products. For medical devices, I think there is an advantage because of the 4 classes of medical devices. And so you can even consider to say, should I rely, for example, in assessment outcome for all classes of medical devices, or should I just adopt a reliance model where I can only request assessment outcome for specific products? I'm going to present in my next slides the collaborative registration procedure between national regulatory authorities and WHO, and in WHO through sharing of the assessment outcome from WHO pre-qualification. And so you may want also to think or consider the fact that WHO has already assessed some of the in vitro diagnostics. Do you also need to repeat assessment of the products that have already been assessed by WHO being a trusted institution? And then also opportunities for reliance. In my previous slide, I mentioned on the existence of very strong regional harmonization initiatives globally, regional-wise, and even in the regional economic communities. And so regulators should also look around and see if there is an opportunity for reliance, either with other members of a regional economic community that you are both participating, or you can look around to see whether you have a neighboring country within your region that has advanced in some of the national regulatory authority functions, so that you can utilize some of the assessment outcome from the more mature national regulatory authorities. One of the key points that I also mentioned when I was talking about the misconception, the myth bust in my first slide, is the issue of the harmonization, convergence, and reliance. So these are 3 concepts that are related. So harmonization is when you're developing standards, and then convergence is when you're implementing the or introducing the developed standards. And then reliance is at the implementation phase where now you are implementing the requirements. So if, for example, your requirements do not align with the rest of the world, or do not align with other mature national regulatory authorities, or if they are not aligned with the requirements that are internationally harmonized, it is difficult and it will not be possible to implement the concept of reliance. So very important that you look for the opportunities for reliance around you and make sure that your requirements are converging as much as possible with the rest of the national regulatory authorities based on internationally harmonized requirements. So in this particular slide, I'm just going to demonstrate very briefly key concepts of reliance. And so from the left side of this slide, it is indicating situation where the national regulatory authorities is implementing their normal standard processes with their independent decision based on its own reviews, based on its own audit, based on its own testing. But as I've also mentioned in my previous slide, that in many times, national regulatory authorities are faced with limited resources. And so you will find that the burden at this model where the national regulatory authorities is conducting everything on its own is a lot. And so we are recommending that regulators really, based on the risk assessment, they should consider adapting reliance models that could really help them in terms of addressing the issue of capacity, but also addressing the issue of workload, but also limited resources that is usually an issue with many of the national regulatory authorities. So as you go in the middle of this slide, this is when the national regulatory authority is deciding to collaborate with the trusted or other national regulatory authorities to facilitate their regulatory work. And here I'm presenting two models. So the first one is work sharing, where, you know, 1 or 3 to 4 countries come together, conduct the assessment together, conduct the audit together, depending on the capacity that is available or shared capacity within the countries, and share also the final recommendations, which is shared by all the participating countries to make the final decision in relation to that regulatory function. So for example, if it is market authorization function, which I'm going to make a lot of reference today. So if it is market authorization, for example, expectation is that they would conduct dossier assessment together. They would also conduct site audit together. They would also conduct performance evaluation, either by identifying a specific accredited lab that would conduct some of the performance evaluation for their products, and then accumulate or consolidate all the assessment outcome to inform market authorization decision. And then there is also another form, which is joint activity, where a specific country can be identified to conduct assessment on behalf of the rest of the countries. And this is also based on the maturity of that national regulatory authority. And it is also need to be demonstrated. The country that is relied upon really has to demonstrate ability to assess or to conduct this technical assessment before, you know, the rest of the countries can really appoint them to conduct these activities on their behalf. And so once this is the assessment has been done, the information is shared with the rest of the countries to inform also market authorization decision. So the country B and C may decide either to conduct minimum assessment, or they may decide to take the final recommendation from the country A and use it to make the final decision with regard to market authorization, as an example. And then there is also a concept of recognition. So as you adopt to the concept of recognition, this is where national regulatory authorities, either unilateral or by mutual recognition, they decide to accept the final decision that is made by another trusted regulatory authority. This is very common during public health emergencies, where some of the countries may not really have the capacity to assess a specific technology that could be new at the time and needed during the public health emergency. So this is just one of the example, or a slide that shows examples of the models that can be considered by regulatory authorities in order to be more efficient and to be more effective in terms of issuing regulatory decision. I'm not going to go through these principles, but I think it is very important that when you're revisiting these slides, you would also be able to remind yourself on the principles, because good practices also is guided by the principles. If you do not consider these principles, it would be difficult to be effective during implementation of the concept of reliance. I also wanted to speak a little bit about the issue of sameness of products. So when you are engaging in any of the reliance model, it is very important that you speak to the same product, because otherwise you would not benefit on the assessment outcome that is shared by the other national regulatory authority or by any trusted institution. And so expectation is that when the applicant is submitting their application through any of the reliance model, you have to make sure that the information that is submitted to you is the same as what was submitted to the country or to the NRA where you are planning to rely, in terms of the regulatory version, whether it is the same data on safety and performance, is it the same manufacturing site, is it the same quality management system that is applied by this manufacturer. So the technical documentation has to be the same in order for you to benefit on the report that is submitted to you. Otherwise, you will be comparing two different products, which will be wrong in terms of the final decision that you're going to make. And also, there is a role by the manufacturer also to confirm the sameness of the product and to provide the same documentation to different NRAs when they are applying for market authorization in the countries that are participating in the any of the reliance models. There could be some exception when you are applying reliance, especially in market authorization. There could be some exception in terms of country-specific information. For example, because of the different climatic zones, different countries may request different studies in terms of stability studies. For example, different countries may have their own requirements in which the manufacturer has to comply. And then also the issue of local labels. So different countries may have their own way in which they would want the label to appear. So these has to be considered by the applicant. But any other technical information in the dossier needs to be the same. The issue of post-approval changes also is very critical, because we want to make sure that the product remains the same when it is placed in the market between the country that is participating in the reliance model and the country that is sharing the assessment outcome. And so, and also, for example, for WHO, if a product is pre-qualified, we want also to make sure that the information that is with WHO is the same as the information that sits with the National Regulatory Authority throughout the life of that product that has been authorized through any of the reliance model. So I've also shared with you on this particular slide resources, areas where you can find different resources or information on reliance. So I've also provided I've repeated the link on the repository for the reliance models. I've also shared with you the link on the good reliance practices document, but also a very interesting short e-learning module on reliance, which is also very interesting, and it is very short. So I really urge you to go to open this link and then navigate through this nicely developed e-learning model on examples of reliance, which I believe you would benefit once you finish this course. So these are the resources that we have developed for you in order to have a better understanding of what reliance is about. In this slide, which I'm not going to go through each of this, but I've just demonstrated to you, just for information, potential barriers for reliance, but also enablers for reliance, including trust. I'm going to repeat some of the things. So trust, there has to be trust between you and the other NRAs that you're planning to rely on. But the issue of convergence and harmonization, I've spoken about this, that requirements have to be as similar as possible for you to benefit on reliance. And so we are promoting convergence and harmonization of requirements, but also economic and legal integration and engagement of stakeholders. So all these factors would really help to implement the concept of reliance. I also want to also go back a little bit and make reference to the GBT Plus medical devices, which is the main topic for this week. And just to demonstrate to you how critical reliance is and the emphasis that is in the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework, but also in the GBT Plus medical devices. So there are about 6 sub-indicators where we are emphasizing or we are requesting evidence on how you are implementing reliance. So there are 2 sub-indicators under regulatory systems, RSO 304 and RSO 901. There is one on market authorization, on post-market surveillance and control. There is one on regulatory inspection, laboratory testing, and also on clinical trial. So just to give maybe example on the 2 sub-indicators under RS regulatory systems, we have RSO 304, which requires that for you, the regulators, to demonstrate whether there is a documented or there are documented policies, procedures, and mechanisms, including written criteria, are established for recognition and reliance on decision of other national regulatory authorities. So I want you to pay attention on the bracket which says, if applicable. There could be cases where national regulatory authorities are self-sufficient. They are able to conduct all the regulatory functions efficiently on their own, but this really needs to be demonstrated during the assessment. So when we are assessing using the GBT Plus medical devices, we would really like for the NRA to demonstrate. If at all this is scored not applicable, we would be interested to see really whether you are actually conducting all the functions related to regulation of medical devices and IVDs comprehensively, and if you have the required resources, you have the required capacities to conduct this. Otherwise, we expect the NRA to be implementing one way or another in any of the 7 regulatory functions, the concept of reliance. This is why you see it appearing in all the 7 functions. And then RSO 901, it is a sub-indicator that requires the NRA to demonstrate if they are participating in any of the regional global network to promote harmonization and convergence. Again, to re-emphasize that if there is no harmonization, there is no convergence in your requirements, it's difficult to implement reliance. And so very important that your requirements matches as much as possible to the internationally harmonized requirements. So this is also one of the sub-indicator that is not, you cannot score not applicable. So this is required that there is some level of engagement, there is some level of participation in the regional or global network. So I wanted just to emphasize this, that this concept is heavily emphasized in both tools, in the GMRF, but also in the GBT Plus medical devices. So I'm going to speak very briefly. I know I have, I think, maybe 5 minutes to finish my presentation, but I want to speak to you a little bit and really to show you the practicability of one of the very popular reliance model that is conducted by WHO, which is the WHO Collaborative Registration Procedure for In Vitro Diagnostics. So the scope at the moment for pre-qualification is only for some specific types of in vitro diagnostics, and we have not started the pre-qualification for medical devices. I know there is already a team that has been established, but we are yet to start the pre-qualification for medical devices, and then we should be able to give you information in the near future on the scope of medical devices, but when we will start the CRP for medical devices. But in the meantime, the collaborative registration procedure scope is only for pre-qualified, a specific type group of assays, in vitro diagnostics assays. So how does this work? So the collaborative registration procedure has 4 important principles that I'm just going to quickly run through. So one is voluntary participation. So we don't force anybody to participate in any of the reliance model, including the collaborative registration procedure for pre-qualified IVDs. I've also mentioned about product sameness. So product sameness has to be confirmed at the time of application in the national regulatory authorities, but also confidentiality, because we are sharing very sensitive information with the consent of the manufacturer. So we maintain the highest level of confidentiality when we are sharing the reports, but also the issue of targeted timelines. So collaborative registration procedure is guided by very strict timelines, and which is 90 days of regulatory decision, but also 30 days in other interactions between WHO and the NRA in terms of sharing the reports, but also regulatory decision from the NRA to the applicant. And these are the three types of products that we share. We share product dossier review report, site audit report, and then the performance evaluation report as conducted by WHO. So very simple, as you're seeing in this slide. WHO, when we receive interest by the NRA to participate in collaborative registration procedure, we ask them to sign an agreement, and specifically because of the confidentiality nature of the procedure itself. And then once this is signed, we check with the National Regulatory Authority whether the applicant of that particular product has submitted their application in the country. When we receive confirmation that the application has been received, WHO shares the PQ confidential reports with the focal points of the countries, who are also required to sign agreements to maintain the confidentiality of the report. So there is a requirement for them to also commit that they will not share these reports with anyone. And then the reports are shared with the expectation of decision within 90 working days. And when there is any query, for example, raised by the NRA, we advise that the NRA contacts WHO, because this is a pre-qualified product. So usually during this interaction, there is also some level of capacity building between for the national regulatory authorities staff, but we provide also a number of support just to make sure that the national regulatory authority focal points are able to conduct abbreviated review on the report and issue the decision within 90 days. I'm going to explain some of these things later. So I'll move a little bit quickly. I think this one I've already addressed a little bit in terms of the flow or the steps for the CRP for IVD's implementation, including also registration maintenance, if there is any post-approval changes, if there is any withdrawal, or if there is any cancellation for registration. So these are the 41 countries that are currently participating in the collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostics. I'm very proud really to get to 41 participating NRAs. I understand that the level of implementation differs a lot, but I've also seen countries advancing in terms of skills, advancing in terms of their confidence to approach any other dossier that is submitted in their national regulatory authorities through our interaction with the regulators in this innovative procedure, CRP. At the moment in this region, we have only 2 NRAs that are participating in the CRP for IVDs procedure, which is El Salvador and Honduras. So congratulations to the NRAs. We are yet to register any of the products, but I believe that in the next, towards the next end of the year or early next year, we should be able to have at least 1 or 2 products to start implementation. And I take this opportunity also to request other regulators to join this important procedure. I've also shared this slide with different resources where you can get more information on the collaborative registration procedure. But I also have, I think, 3 slides, and then I'll be done with my presentation, just to show you, to demonstrate to you in terms of numbers, how we have progressed from when, the CRP for IVD started to at least last year or to date. So in terms of the number of agreements, you can see in 2019, we had only 5, and these 5 was based on the pilot that we conducted for this procedure. And then so we have grown from 2 agreements, in 2020 to 13 agreements in 2023, and of course to 41 in 2024. 5. In 2024, there was less number of countries participating because we shifted our focus to product registration. At some point, we realized that we were focusing on countries joining, but we were not really focusing on product registration, which is the most important objective for us. As much as we use CRP, but we also want to make sure that products gets registered. And in terms of regions, of course, this, and I hope you can, let me just see if I can move this. So you can see Afro is leading in terms of participation with 91%, and this is based on last year's figure. But we also have a moderate participation in CRO, AMRO, and EMRO. I also wanted to demonstrate briefly in terms of the number of popular assays that are registered through the collaborative registration procedure. And this is the data of 2025. So we have 12, I think malaria and HIV are the ones that are leading. So we have 12 and 7, and then the rest is 2, 2, 2. But also we are very optimistic this year that we are going to have a lot of registration. So if you look at 2024, total registrations were 33, which was very, very good compared to the previous years. But we, until June 2025, we already have 25. And there is a lot of other products that are under review at the moment. So I think by the end of the year, we will have a lot of products registered. And this is based on the increased interest in countries. So just one of the last slide, and this is just to indicate some of the interventions that we undertake in WHO. One is we conduct manufacturers workshop to really promote also use of the CRP, because I think one of the pain points from the manufacturers was the unreliability or lack of clarity in terms of the registration timeline. So with CRP, this is guaranteed. So we usually have manufacturers workshop, but we also conduct CRP annual meeting once per year to really receive feedback from the participants of CRP, but also to demonstrate some of the tools and some of the interventions that we have conducted to make sure that CRP continues to run swiftly. And then we also conduct regional workshops, but also individual NRI training based on requests. We understand that there is issue on capacity, especially for assessment of IVD's technical files. So we conduct also trainings with individual countries, although we don't encourage too much one-on-one apart from NRIs that are participating in CRP, but we have seen a lot of value in terms of this engagement. We have also developed different tools to assist the NRIs, including also a very nice document which is called Good Practices in Implementing Collaborative Registration Procedure, that explains also the different assessment pathways and also recommendations on which pathway you can use for which product and for which pathway. But also internally, we have developed the EPQS. This is a dedicated platform to facilitate information exchange, including also sharing of the reports with NRI, but also feedback from the NRI during implementation of the collaborative registration procedure. So I think this is the last slide. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. Very insightful and a lot of information with your presentation, a very clear description you provided to us. Let me switch very quick to Spanish. A todos, muchas gracias. Les instamos a utilizar la sección de preguntas y respuestas en este momento para atención de Agnes. Agnes, there are 4 questions already stated in the Q&A section. The first one is from Rumi Cabrera. It's in English, indeed. It says, on the GBT Plus medical devices, there is a definition about falsified medical product. And she says, with reach to medical devices. So the question is there other specific definition for falsified medical devices needed?
Okay. Yeah, so I see Anita is typing, and I don't know
Yes.
if Anita wants to respond to this one.
Yeah, thanks, Agnes, and thanks for the question, Rumi. You would be able to use the same definition for medical devices as you would for medical products. That means any medical device that deliberately, fraudulently misrepresents its identity, composition, or source. So I would say you could use the same definition, and I'll put that here in the chat.
Thank you, Anita. The next question that's already in the chat is from Ana Maria Chura, and I translated to you. She said that in case of batch release, the agency performs a process of entirely through documentation, is therefore able to complete within the required time frames with minimal resources. Is it still necessary to apply reliance to this activity?
Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, she's asking regarding the batch release. So she's explaining that the agency performs the batch release entirely through documentation, and therefore is able to complete within the required timeframes and minimal resources. So under this condition, if there is still necessary to apply reliance to this activity.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much, Ana Maria, for that interesting question, which I feel when I was listening to you, Alfonso, I feel like partly she has responded to the question, because if, for example, there is capacity, and let me just go back a little bit on one of my slides where I explained on the strategy that NRIs need to use when you are determining which process or which function you will need to use reliance. So, for example, if it is in the batch release, you realize that with the minimum resources that you have, you are able to adequately, let me use that term, adequately assess safety and performance of that particular batch, then you don't really need to use the reliance. But there could be also maybe other activities within a specific function that you may require to use reliance. So I think the message of one size fits all, not one size fits all, is critical here to say, is this where I need to put my resources, or I can use this resource somewhere else? So I hope I've been able to answer Anna's question.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, Anna, if you need a further clarification, feel free to write it down. We have a next question from Edna Karime Diaz. She's asking regarding the indicators. One of them relates to laboratory capacity. How is this indicator evaluated, considering that some countries do not have laboratories? And in others, there are testing laboratories, but they do not perform the tests on all medical devices.
So that's a very good question, honestly. And I don't know specifically which sub-indicator she's talking about, but I do understand the concern. So one of the, and I'm going to also make a reference to the Global Model Regulatory Framework. In the Global Model Regulatory Framework, which I presented on the first day, I re-emphasize and I made a point to say, we are and I think this was also mentioned by Anita in one of her presentations, that we are discouraging testing of medical devices or IVDs at the pre-market phase, or at any point, unless there is a justification on why you want to conduct testing of these products. So first of all, I have not seen, based on my previous experience or my experience, I've never seen any national regulatory authority that has capacity to test each and every medical device, okay? And so this is not practical. The the responsibility to confirm safety and performance of medical devices and IVDs is vested to the manufacturer of the product. He is the one that needs to demonstrate safety and performance of the product based on the documentation that they are submitting to the National Regulatory Authority. And so it is very important that this is taken into consideration. But I also do understand that there could be cases where testing is required. For example, there are countries that have identified some specific diagnostics for lot-to-lot verification. So during importation, there is a requirement that specific number of batches are tested before the products can be distributed in the public facilities. So if this is a requirement, then there has to be a capacity. There has to be a capacity within the countries, either within the National Regulatory Authority or the national reference laboratories, which are usually under the Ministry of Health. So there has to be some level of capacity to allow testing of these products. But I think just for me to re-emphasize that it is not possible to test each and every medical devices, and this is why very important, and I want also to re-emphasize that risk-based approach is key. Otherwise, you will not be able to do all the testing for all the products that are coming to your country. Over.
Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. Indeed, it was a very interesting question. I was wondering myself. So thank you very much for your insights. We have the next question. Again, gracias. Thank you, Ana Maria Chura. She's asking, do all WHO listed authorities publish or issue technical evaluation report? And are they, whether for open to public or not? How could regional agencies, I assume she's referring to agencies in our region, can have access to those reports? If you can please comment on that.
Okay, so it's a very interesting question. So thank you once again, Ana Maria Chura, for that question. So let me also explain that for medical devices, at the moment the scope has not been expanded to the WLA. So WLA at the moment is still with the medicine. But let me just use maybe the current term, which is the stringent regulatory authorities. In the side of medicines, through collaborative registration procedure, we have a specific procedure that allows WHO to collaborate with more mature national regulatory authorities and facilitate exchange of assessment outcomes with the national regulatory authorities. So these are unredacted reports with the concept of the stringent regulatory authorities. They are shared with WHO for sharing with the national regulatory authorities. So for medical devices, we plan to expand the scope next year to include also a collaborative registration procedure with stringent regulatory authorities for medical devices. And so we should be looking out for this procedure next year. And what we normally do, and I'm borrowing an example for medicine, the information is not available in public. Remember, this is a confidential information in which the manufacturer also consents to sharing of this information. And so we don't put them in the public platforms, but we use internal confidential platform to facilitate transferring of these assessment outcomes with the NRA. So from the, let's say, stringent regulatory authorities, aka WLA, to WHO, and then from WHO to the NRA that has signed to participate in the collaborative registration procedure with stringent regulatory authorities. So Anna should be on the lookout for this procedure next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. Next question is from an anonymous attendee. Anna is asking about the pre-qualified products, IVDs specifically, that WHO perform. The question is if WHO perform the pre-qualification test under or through accredited laboratories.
Okay. So thank you very much. And maybe Anita, you might also want to speak to this, but yes, there are laboratories that has been identified. I'm not so sure of the term accredited. I know we don't use the term accreditation, but these are the laboratories that have been approved or identified by WHO to conduct performance evaluation for specific in vitro diagnostics that are within the scope of pre-qualification. And so yes, there is, but we don't use the term accreditation. But Anita, if you want to also add to that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We use the term WHO PQ evaluating laboratories. So if you're interested in this as an institution, you have to apply to the pre-qualification team, and there is a process under which you would be designated or listed, so to speak, as a PQ evaluating laboratory. So it's not the same as accreditation at all. We're not an accrediting body. We list institutions for particular analytes and particular pathogens. So you don't get a blanket listing. You would be, for example, HIV nucleic acid tests or hepatitis C antigen tests, because a lot of that is predicated on you having access to appropriate clinical specimens to be able to conduct the pre-qualification performance evaluation. Over.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita.
Alfonso, I'm just looking at time. Maybe I need also your guidance, because I think I have until 5.
Yes.
To also go through sub-indicators, so I need to be guided.
So no, yeah, please. We have 4 more questions, but in terms of interests of time, we can continue with the next part of the session. And if we have time left at the end after the discussion or final reflection, final thoughts, we can come back to respond to these questions.
Excellent. So thank you very much for all the good questions. And if it happens we don't have time to respond during this session, happy to take up these questions after, and then we can respond in writing. So let me just jump quickly to one of the sub-indicator that maybe we can use the last 6 minutes to go through. Alfonso, can you confirm if you can see the GBT?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I believe by now, regulators are able to know how to navigate through at least the main screen and to access the different functions in the GBT Plus medical devices. So we are going to just take one example under market authorization. So as mentioned by Andrea when she was demonstrating use of the GBT on day 1, I've already opened market authorization, so it's in blue. I've not opened the rest of the functions, so it's still in gray. So I will open the 2 to go to market authorization or registration function. And so when you go to, I wanted to do MA04 because I know we've discussed a little bit when I was presenting on RIS, when Andrea was doing RILI, when Anita was doing PS, at least we touched a little bit on legal provision. So today I wanted us to go to MA04. So this is a specific indicator that talks about existence of procedure which have been established by the NRI to perform registration and market authorization functions. And I'm going to open MA0401, which is a maturity level 3 indicator, and to see how we are going to address this one. So if, and I also encourage you guys to open your tools on your side so that you can have, you can work with me as we are going through this particular sub-indicator. So as presented previously with the other colleagues as well, there is the first part, which is NRI input that we expect for you to fill the information in here. There is an assessor output in which the assessor will provide their input. but also very important to look at the fact sheet, especially on this particular menu that talks about the scope, description, objective, requirement, evidence to review, reference framework, rating scale, limitations and remarks. And so if you go to limitation and remarks, it says scoring this sub-indicator as not applicable is excluded. So we have to address this sub-indicator. We cannot score it not applicable because it is required that we address this because of its significance in the regulatory systems. If you look at the scope, medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics, is within the scope. So this sub-indicator is applicable also for medical devices and IVDs. Again, the area of IDP, if we find any issue, but also reviewed document, both for the NRA and for the assessor will need to be included here. So let's just go back to the sub-indicator itself. So it's MA0401. This sub-indicator requires that there is a documented procedure or documented procedures, could be more than one, and tools are implemented for the assessment of the different parts of the application. That is quality, safety, efficacy, performance, because this, don't mind the language, because this scope also include other medical products. It's not very specific to medical devices and IVDs. And so it requires documented procedures and tools which are implemented for the assessment of the different parts of the application and for the assessment of specific requirements applicable to specific classes of medical devices. And I think here it was meant really for medical devices. So again, when you go to, this is the first place that I usually go. If I already understand what is required of the sub-indicator, or at least I have read the sub-indicator title, I would either go to the description or I would go to evidence to review. So if you look at the evidence to review, there are at least 5 evidences that the assessor would need to confirm, but we'll also expect the NRA to provide their feedback under the NRA input. So the first one says the first evidence that the assessor would review is whether the documented procedures and tools, including SOP, that are developed and used in the assessment of different parts of registration or market authorization application, or in the assessment of particular requirements applicable to a specific class of medical devices. So these were some of the responses that I was just putting when I was preparing for this session. It is very important that you indicate if there is an existence of procedure. So we expect the procedure to be in place, understanding that there is a requirement for national regulatory authorities to be ISO 9001 certified. And so if you're implementing 9001, ISO 9001, 2015, it means we expect to have, for you guys to have very well, documented procedures to support your regulatory functions or processes, including also processes related to market authorization. And so expectation is that there will be a procedure that talks about how to manage applications that are coming to your organization for market authorization, or others call it registration. So you have to indicate what is if it's available. If it's not available, then you'll have to indicate that you don't have such an SOP and then develop your IDP. But if, for example, you have that SOP, you have to indicate what is the name of that SOP, because for QMS, documents are titled. So you have to document that SOP, but you also have to include the number of that document, because according to QMS, again, documents have to be traceable, so they are numbered. So you have to include also number. You have to include also the validity of that SOP. And of course, the SOP itself would also indicate the revision history. And then if, for example, there is any electronic tool, because remember, on the evidence to review, it is also asking for tools. So if, for example, there is any tool, any electronic tool that maybe the applicants would upload their dossiers, they would upload their applications, we expect also to see this tool, a functioning tool but also if it is just an Excel sheet, we would also expect to see this tool. Usually for such tools, as much as they will be mentioned in the SOP as part of the market authorization process, but we expect also to see work instructions. If there is a new staff, if there is anybody who has been transferred from somewhere else to your section, they should be able to navigate through this tool based on the written work instructions. So very important that the work instruction name, number of the work instruction, but the SOP that is associated with that work instruction also need to be demonstrated. There is also another evidence that is supposed to be shown here, which is the SOP used for different parts of market authorization applications, such as receipt, screening, review, and decision-making. When I was just going through this, it reminded me on my old days when I was a regulator on how we used to sometimes misplace the dossier. You know, sometimes we misplace samples. You know, sometimes we don't find which sample is for which dossier. So there is a lot that can happen at the time of receiving when the applicant is coming to apply for market authorization. There has to be a systematic way in which these applications are received. If it is online, then we expect to have a specific SOP that also indicates that application will be received online, and then it will go, I don't know, to the first receiving officer, and then receiving officer will inform maybe the manager, etc. So we also expect to see an SOP that describes how these applications are received, how are they screened, because screening is also very critical, because this is where you can really go back to your applicant and tell them that, you know, your application is not complete, you need to do A, B, C, D in order to meet the requirements for assessment, and so please go back, correct A, B, C, D. So we need also to see whether there is screening and how that is described, and also decision. For example, if the application has to be submitted to the technical committee, or it has to be submitted somewhere else for decision, all this has to be described in an SOP. So this is also required to be in place. But if it is not there, it means this is an IDP. You need to go to your IDP and say the SOP for market authorization on maybe receiving, screening, reviewing, and decision-making is not available. And then you create an IDP to develop such an SOP to address that process. And then another one is the evidence of use of these SOPs. For example, you can check whether there is, one of the evidence is to check whether there is any major milestone in terms of, for example, issuance of final decision. Was there a certificate that was issued? And this, I think in particular, it requires really to demonstrate that there are a record associated to that process. For example, if it is a technical committee, are there minutes, how many products were approved in that technical committee? Or if it is going to the DG, the decision has to be made available for the assessors also to see. But also, I think most important is the issue of record keeping and ease of retrieving such information. And then the other one is document addressing the scope and the extent of the assessment. I think this is also very important. And I will also share, I think on chat, one of the documents that we have developed for collaborative registration procedure that itemized different pathways that can be or pathways or categories of assessment that can be applied to medical devices. For example, there could be an SOP that talks about application during routine or standard processes. There could be another SOP that talks about application during non-routine processes, when there is emergency, when there is unavailability of a specific medical devices and you wish to have this product in your country, but you don't have application for registration. So how are you going to allow that product to go in the market? And of course, scenarios such as donation. There are many countries that are receiving donation. There are many countries that are using, for example, reliance. Countries that may want to describe, for example, processes for complicated products such as combination products or borderline products. So we really need to see documents, either a guideline or SOP, which is addressing the scope but extent of assessment processes for specific types of market authorization processes or for specific type of complicated products. And then documents addressing the registration application backlog. So also my experience as a regulator, in many cases, we would find ourselves to have a lot of backlog. So we will have, for example, applications that have been sitting with us maybe for 6 months, for 1 year. And so we want also to see whether there is a document or a guideline that is addressing backlogs. But if it is not available, then this has to be documented as IDP. So I think in a nutshell, this is one of the important sub-indicator that I wanted to really discuss with you so that you can really see the level of assessment and the level of requirement which can be requested in one of the sub-indicators for you to really demonstrate that you are correctly and efficiently conducting specific processes, especially for such critical processes as market authorization. So I think I will stop here because I see I'm already running out of time. So with that, I think I would hand over back to Andrea.
So if we reflect upon the benchmarking manual, and the link is provided on the slide, this presentation is available on the SharePoint under the Day 5 folder. But ultimately, to start the journey for the overall benchmarking process, we would need to receive a receipt of request for a formal benchmarking. And there are quite a number of steps and timelines that are involved on this journey. So once we had received requests from a specific country to go ahead with benchmarking as such, we would do an introduction and share with you the RSS program, the Regulatory System Strengthening Program. Already in this webinar, we provided an introduction into the Regulatory System Strengthening Program. And we would also develop and create a specific SharePoint for your country to facilitate the self-benchmarking process. So the SharePoint would have a repository of all your information in terms of the data file that you would use for the self-benchmarking, as well as folders under which all the supported evidence that you would need to submit could be uploaded and organized. We would then also share with you some information with specifics about how to do a self-benchmarking, how to prepare your IDPs. So wherever there were any gaps identified in your system, how to document those in the form of the institutional development plan. And once you had completed self-benchmarking of all the regulatory functions, we would then invite you to submit your final data file, and we would review your uploaded evidence on the SharePoint and verify. Yes, please, Alfonso.
Apologies for interrupting you, Andrea, but I was talking to my colleagues that this slide is very interesting. Would be possible if you can copy the link into the chat so we can disseminate it to all the attendees. That would be very helpful.
Sure. Yes, sure, I can do that for you. No problem. Thank you.
But we can do it later. So continue with your speech.
Okay, super. No worries. And then once we verified your self-benchmarking data file and looked at the IDPs, we can already identify if there are those key areas where you may need some additional support for IDP implementation, or help you prioritize which IDPs do you need to start with first. And finally, we would schedule for a formal benchmarking of the regulatory system. You have seen this slide before, and this is really just a summary of the roadmap that you've seen previously, where it just describes those steps. You would have to complete a self-benchmarking. Your data file would be verified. We'd do a formal benchmarking, but along the way, we would be able to support you in terms of capacity building, in terms of identifying which IDPs should be prioritized, and also making recommendations of how to go about the actions to be taken to implement IDPs. Another key element of this is if you were interested in requesting support from the CIP, the WHO Coalition of Interested Parties Network, which is, as I mentioned before, a group of technical and financial partners who are supporting regulatory system strengthening in countries. You would have to also complete your self-benchmarking for all the regulatory functions so that we would have a full listing of IDPs, because it is that list of IDPs that we then present to the CIP network to identify where they may be able to provide technical or financial support for IDP implementation. And also just to note that the CIP network is a voluntary network, so once we share the IDPs with the network, they are able to determine based on their mandates and organizational objectives where they may be able to support. Then also just to note, on this SharePoint that we developed for this particular webinar, there is a folder that says CIP Network Support. And within that folder, if you are interested to request support from the CIP network, there is a template which explains how to prepare the request to request support from CIP network. And you would also be needing to sign a consent form. This would be the consent from the country to share the outcomes of a benchmarking with the CIP network. So in the context of a self-benchmarking, once you had completed a self-benchmarking, you would have a list of IDPs generated as well as a self-benchmarking report. So we would need to have your consent because WHO would never share country-specific information related to benchmarking activities with anybody unless we had the written consent from the country. And then just lastly, in terms of a roadmap and next step, initially we would have to receive a formal benchmarking request. We would have to complete your self-benchmarking for all the regulatory functions. You may request CIP network support if you wish to do so. It's optional. We would have to verify your self-benchmarking data file, and then we would move to the formal benchmarking. So this is really just a summary in terms of the flow and what you could expect on the journey of benchmarking.
Thank you, Andrea. Y muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Estamos llegando casi al final de este taller. Ha sido de un taller, en mi opinión, exitoso, de muchísimo provecho. Antes de pasar a dar mensajes finales, no quiero dejar de agradecer una vez más a nuestras colegas en OMS, Agnes Quillo, Anita Sanz, a Andrea Cater y a la que hoy no tenemos el honor de que nos esté acompañando, pero por todo el tiempo y dedicación que nos han prestado a nosotros, a la región. Quiero informarles que parte del éxito que tuvimos en este primer taller, y lo menciono como un primer, ya voy a comentar la justificación, que el lunes Mariluz compartió con todos que tuvimos más de 440 participantes registrados. Por lo general, la divulgación permite tener un número de registros mayor a la participación. Y aún así, participantes activos durante los 4 días en promedio fueron más de 350 para cada uno de los 4 de 24 países de nuestra región. Entonces, esto para nosotros es una evidencia del gran interés que existe en la región sobre el tema regulación de dispositivos médicos, y es un llamado de atención hacia la necesidad de que existan estrategias de capacitación y acompañamiento técnico que, como lo dijo Andrea, junto con la OMS, la OPS, vamos a estar para acompañarlos. Me parece que cumplimos con el objetivo del taller, que era establecer una línea de base. Sabemos que en nuestra región hay diferentes niveles regulatorios y queríamos empezar de estos fundamentos para, a partir de aquí, continuar creciendo en capacitaciones. Al respecto, les adelanto que una de las estrategias que vamos a abordar desde la OPS y principalmente en su papel de secretariado de la Red PAR, y es el compromiso en el fortalecimiento de capacidades regulatorias, es el diseño de sesiones técnicas para poder brindar capacitación en conjunto con todos los países miembros en formación de capacidades, pero a un nivel de detalle mayor. Iríamos función regulatoria por función regulatoria y yendo a un nivel de revisar cada uno de los subindicadores, donde aquellos estados miembros que tienen un nivel regulatorio más elevado puedan compartir sus experiencias con los países que estamos avanzando en ese proceso de formar capacidades. Un par de mensajes técnicos antes de explicar la siguiente y última etapa, es el acceso al material. Hemos recibido diferentes consultas vía directa, vía por chat, respecto a cómo acceder a los diferentes recursos de este taller. Primero, el acceso al SharePoint. Y en el SharePoint se encuentran las presentaciones traducidas y además lo que nos acaba de presentar Andrea. Sabemos que algunos de ustedes aún tienen dificultades para acceder, a pesar de que hemos verificado que todos los correos registrados hayan tenido acceso. Existen recomendaciones al respecto. Una es, utilicen el correo que registraron dentro de su proceso para intentar acceder al SharePoint. Revisen también en su carpeta de spam si no han recibido ahí la confirmación. Y si ninguna de estas dos acciones les funciona, por favor, escríbanos directamente a Nilda, mi colega Nilda Enríquez, a Jenny Soto o a mí, quien les pido que por favor coloquen los correos nuestros en el chat, para de esa forma nosotros poder centralizar y poder ayudar con la solución de la consulta. Además, recuerden que todas estas sesiones fueron grabadas en los 3 idiomas. Próximamente, una vez finalice la edición, vamos a subirlas al canal de YouTube de la OPS, pero además vamos a colocarlas dentro del itinerario formativo RegTech del campus virtual de salud pública de la OPS, para que puedan servir de referencia, ya sea refrescamiento o formación de nuevos personal. Sabemos que hay una rotación muy importante dentro de nuestras instituciones, para que pueda ser consultado. Ok, y el mensaje final es que a transmitir es, en ese compromiso que asumimos, tanto la OMS como la OPS, comprometidos en el fortalecimiento de capacidades regulatorias de los Estados miembros, vamos a trabajar junto con ustedes en fortalecer iniciativas de fortalecimiento de capacidades basados en buenas prácticas y en ciencias regulatorias, pero además también se ofrece el acompañamiento apropiado cuando se inicien los ejercicios de evaluación del marco global de modelo regulatorio. Dicho esto, algo muy importante también, el agradecimiento a ustedes por su interés, pero a los colegas que también estuvieron detrás dentro de la coordinación, Nilda Enríquez, Jenny Soto, Frank Raposa, y a todo el equipo de interpretación hacia español-inglés que nos permitió tener una mayor divulgación de este contenido. Entonces, gracias a ustedes. Ok, el siguiente. Antes de finalizar, lo que queremos es tomarnos una foto para poder registrar esta participación de todos. Les había dicho que estamos buscando soluciones y lo que encontramos es lo siguiente. Mis colegas van a colocar en el chat para todos ustedes un enlace para saltar a otra plataforma. Vamos a saltar a una plataforma, una sesión por Teams. Yo voy a compartir mi pantalla también para aquellos que quieran conectarse desde su computadora, desde su teléfono, perdón, escaneen el código QR o, como mencioné, hagan clic en el enlace directo que mi colega Nilda acaba de colocar en el chat. Entonces, con esto cerramos la sesión de Zoom y vamos a saltar todos a Teams, abrimos cámara y sonreímos y vamos a tomar varios screenshots que utilizaremos para después divulgación de resultados de este taller. Una vez más, muchas gracias por su participación, por su interés y gracias, colegas de OMS. Felicidades a todos. Vamos entonces a Teams.